The authorization form on my laptop said I had approved a honeymoon worth $27,840. It carried my full name, a copy of my driver's license, and a signature that looked so much like mine that my stomach tightened before my mind caught up. Then I read the note beneath it. Documents delivered in person at rehearsal dinner. I pressed the phone harder against my ear and asked the travel agent to repeat her question. Claire, were you at the rehearsal dinner Friday night when you signed this? Lila Grant asked. My fingers went cold against the keyboard. No, I wasn't at the rehearsal dinner. I wasn't invited to the wedding. I forced myself to breathe before I said anything else. Put the booking on fraud hold. Don't change a note, delete an email, or call anyone connected to the reservation. Send everything to me through the email address already on my customer profile. Before I tell you how my own sister put my name on a trip I never approved, I hope you're doing well today. Stay with me, because the wedding was only the first lie, and please subscribe to the channel if you enjoy stories about people who finally stop letting family use love as a weapon. Less than 24 hours earlier, I had still believed the worst thing Mallory had taken from me was my place beside her at the ceremony. That Sunday afternoon, the heat in Durham clung to my clothes before I had crossed the grocery store parking lot. Mallory's wedding was supposed to be close, but I had never received an invitation, a rehearsal schedule, or the final honeymoon itinerary she had promised to send me. I had spent weeks telling myself there had to be a harmless explanation, perhaps a printing mistake, a smaller ceremony, or one more delay caused by Mallory changing her mind for the 5th time. She answered on the 4th ring. Music and laughter spilled through the phone, followed by someone calling her the new Mrs. Cole. Hey, Claire, she said, sounding almost amused. What's up? I stopped beside my car with one hand on the hot door handle. When's the wedding? Mallory laughed, not nervously or apologetically, but as if I had asked a question with an obvious answer. Yesterday. Family only. For a few seconds, the parking lot went strangely quiet around me. My chest tightened, but I did not ask why our parents counted as family while I did not. I did not beg for photographs or demand an explanation she had clearly prepared to enjoy. I thought about the folder on my laptop labeled Mallory Honeymoon, the airline options I had researched, and the $8,000 budget I had offered as her wedding gift. Then I guess you don't need my gift, I said. Her laughter stopped, and she told me not to be dramatic. I ended the call before she could change the subject or put our mother on the line. By the time I drove home, the hurt had settled into something sharper. I had not promised Mallory unlimited access to my bank account. Months earlier, I had offered to cover airfare and 5 nights at a resort, up to $8,000, after I approved the final itinerary. That was generous, but it was also a limit I could afford without touching my emergency savings. In early June, Mallory had emailed me an itinerary for nearly $28,000. It included business-class flights, a private villa, a personal driver, spa packages, and excursions she described as essential. I had replied in writing that I would not approve it and reminded her of the $8,000 cap. She responded with a heart emoji and the words, "We'll figure it out." I had assumed that meant she would choose something reasonable. I should have known Mallory's version of figuring things out usually meant waiting until someone else felt too guilty to say no. That evening, I opened the honeymoon folder and forwarded my June refusal to Lila at the agency. I wrote that I was withdrawing any unapproved gift and that no new charge should be processed in my name. I did not call my parents because my mother, Diane, had a gift for turning a clear boundary into proof that I was jealous, cold, or too obsessed with money. I knew better than to argue with her while I was still angry enough to say something she could repeat without context. The next morning, my phone showed 23 missed calls. The first voicemail was Mallory, furious that I had embarrassed her in front of Ryan. The second was my mother saying I was punishing the family over a guest list. My father asked me to call before things got worse, while Ryan said the honeymoon had already been promised and vendors were depending on the payment. With every message, the story shifted farther from the truth, as though enough people repeating a lie could turn it into a contract. The final voicemail was from Mallory. Her voice had lost its anger, and she sounded breathless, almost afraid. "Claire, call me back. You didn't call the travel agent, did you?" That was the moment I understood this was not simply about a sister losing a gift she had taken for granted. Mallory was scared of what the travel agent might tell me. I called Lila before I returned a single family message. Lila explained that her agency still had a payment token from a trip I had purchased for my parents' anniversary 3 years earlier. They did not keep my card number in plain text, but the token remained active when my bank issued a replacement card. Someone had contacted the agency, asked to use the same payment method on file, and submitted an authorization in my name. A junior employee named Evan had placed the resort villa on hold and requested a deposit of $3,500. The deposit was still pending, while the airline tickets and most of the resort balance had not been issued. "The email address was close to yours, but not exact," Lila said. "The callback number didn't match your customer profile either. I caught it during our exception review this morning." I checked my banking app and found the pending authorization less than an hour old. I told Lila to preserve the customer notes, uploaded files, timestamps, and call logs, and I asked her not to contact the bride until the records were secure. Lila did not pretend the agency had done everything right. She admitted the request should have received stronger verification before anyone touched a payment token that old. Her honesty made me trust her more, but it also left an ugly possibility hanging between us. Either someone at the agency had been dangerously careless, or someone in my family knew enough about my old booking to make the request look legitimate. When Lila sent the authorization, I enlarged the signature until the pixels blurred. It looked exactly like mine, because part of it was mine. 3 years earlier, when I had paid for my parents' anniversary trip, my pen had skipped halfway through the final stroke of my last name. The same broken line appeared on this form. It had not been signed. It had been copied. Then I opened the attached image of my driver's license. A triangular crease marked the lower corner of the scan. I had seen that crease before on the photocopy my mother kept in a blue family emergency file inside her safe. She said the file was for hurricanes, hospital visits, and lost wallets. I had objected when she asked for the copy, but my father told me she was only being careful. The form contained one more detail, printed in smaller type beneath the signature block. It said I had personally handed my identification to the bride at the rehearsal dinner. Whoever created the document had not merely stolen my signature. They had invented a history in which I had been present, cooperative, and fully informed. I stared at that line until the words stopped looking real. I had never been invited to the rehearsal dinner. By Tuesday morning, I had stopped wondering whether Mallory had excluded me by accident. The wedding photographs answered that question before anyone in my family did. An old coworker named Jenna sent me a link with a cheerful message saying the ceremony looked beautiful and that she was sorry we had missed each other. She clearly believed I had been there. I opened the album at my kitchen table and found a ballroom filled with round tables, white flowers, champagne glasses, and more faces than I could count without slowing down. One photograph showed Mallory and Ryan beneath a gold sign that read, 112 of our favorite people. Another showed our parents smiling beside relatives we had not seen in years. Mallory had invited former coworkers, college friends, distant cousins, neighbors, and the woman who had once taught her weekend yoga classes. Her wedding had been full of everyone except me. I did not comment beneath the photographs. I did not send Mallory a message asking how 112 people qualified as family. I saved the album link, took screenshots that included the upload times, and created a new folder on my laptop. The part of me that handled contracts for a living understood something the wounded sister in me had not yet accepted. Once people realized I was collecting evidence, they would begin deleting, editing, and explaining. I needed the original story before my family learned I no longer intended to accept it. A few minutes later, my Aunt Susan sent me a private message. She said the wedding had been lovely, but she was sorry my conference had kept me in Toronto. I read that sentence twice before replying. I asked who had told her I was in Canada. Susan answered, that my mother had explained everything at the rehearsal dinner. According to Diane, I had an important work conference I could not leave, and I had chosen not to make Mallory anxious by discussing it before the ceremony. My mother had not merely hidden the wedding from me. She had given my absence a respectable explanation and made it sound like another sacrifice I had volunteered to make. I told Susan I had never been in Toronto and had never known the wedding date. She immediately apologized, then began defending herself, even though I had not accused her of anything. She said everyone had believed Diane because the explanation sounded reasonable. That was true. I often traveled for work, and my family had spent years describing me as too busy for ordinary life. I asked Susan not to confront anyone. I only wanted to know whether she still had the invitation or a photograph of the seating chart. 10 minutes later, she sent both. The invitation confirmed the date had been finalized months earlier. The seating chart was even worse. There was a table labeled immediate family near the dance floor. My parents sat there beside Mallory, Ryan's parents, and Ryan's sister. There was no empty chair. There was no card with my name removed at the last minute. There had never been a place reserved for me. Mallory had not panicked during the final week and cut the guest list. My exclusion had been designed early enough for someone to print it on heavy cream paper. The photograph of my driver's license remained open on my second screen. The triangular crease in the corner kept pulling my attention back to the blue folder in my mother's safe. Diane had created that family emergency file years earlier, after a hurricane knocked out power across part of the state. She asked each of us for copies of our identification, insurance information, and emergency contacts. I had resisted. Keeping that much personal information together seemed less like preparation and more like an invitation to disaster. My father had laughed and told me my mother was simply being careful. "Family doesn't keep score," Diane had said when I asked why she needed a copy of my license instead of just my emergency contact information. She used that sentence whenever someone wanted something from me. It sounded generous, until I noticed that the person being told not to keep score was always the person expected to give. I had handed over the copy because refusing would have produced days of phone calls about trust, fear, and what might happen if I were unconscious in a hospital. Now the same damaged corner appeared on a document used to authorize a luxury honeymoon. Ryan called that afternoon. He did not say hello. He said Mallory had been crying since morning, and the resort was about to release the villa. His voice was tight with anger and exhaustion. He accused me of punishing his wife because I had not been invited to the ceremony. I let him finish before I asked the only question that mattered. "Did you ever hear me personally agree to pay nearly $28,000? There was a short pause. Then he said I had already set aside the money. He spoke as if we were discussing an account both of us had reviewed together. "Mallory told me about the sister fund," he said. "She said you created it years ago because you knew weddings were expensive." I stood beside my kitchen counter with one hand wrapped around the edge. "There is no sister fund." He gave a bitter laugh. "Claire, both families planned around that money." I should have slowed down. Ryan was not calling as an investigator. He was a man who had woken up 3 days into his marriage and learned that the trip he believed was paid for might disappear. He was angry, embarrassed, and still convinced his wife had told him the truth. Instead of recognizing any of that, I answered from the part of myself that knew numbers did not become real just because several adults wanted them to be. Then both families planned with money they never verified. The words were accurate, but accuracy was not the same as wisdom. Ryan heard contempt where I had meant fact. He said I sounded exactly the way Mallory had warned him I would sound, then ended the call. I stared at the dark screen and knew I had made my first real mistake. My family had spent years portraying me as cold and superior. I had just handed Ryan a sentence that fit their story perfectly. I wanted to call him back and explain, but explanation given too quickly often sounded like fear. Instead, I wrote down everything he had said. Sister fund. Both families. Planned around the money. I added those phrases to the timeline beneath the false Toronto conference and the missing place on the seating chart. The pattern had grown beyond a forged travel form. Mallory had created an entire social version of me, one who declined invitations, funded large purchases, and preferred not to speak for herself. Ryan sent a screenshot just before dinner. His message said, "This is what she showed me. Tell me this isn't what you meant." The screenshot was from a conversation between him and Mallory the previous November. Mallory had written, "Claire already set aside the sister fund. She just wants the honeymoon to feel like a surprise." Ryan had responded with a message, saying he felt uncomfortable accepting that much. Mallory told him not to worry, because helping her was important to me. The date mattered more than the words. Mallory had invented the fund months before she sent me the luxury itinerary, and long before I rejected it. She had not exaggerated a real promise after becoming excited about the resort. She had built her wedding budget around money she had never asked me for, then treated my limited offer as proof that the rest would eventually appear. My $8,000 gift had not created her expectation. It had only given her a believable detail to attach to a much larger lie. I was still studying the screenshot when Lila emailed me another export from the agency's customer notes. She explained that it was a note entered by the employee who had handled the first call from the person claiming to be me. The caller had said she met Ryan's parents at the rehearsal dinner and that everyone understood the gift arrangement. She also asked the agency not to contact my regular number because the honeymoon was meant to remain a surprise for Mallory. The lie had been constructed carefully enough to answer questions before anyone asked them. If the agency wondered why I was paying, both families supposedly knew. If they wondered why they could not call me, the trip was a surprise. If Ryan wondered why I never thanked him or discussed the booking, I was private and busy. If relatives wondered why I was absent, I was in Toronto. Every path back to me had been blocked with a different explanation. That was when I understood why Mallory could not risk inviting me. It was not only because she wanted the room to herself, or because she enjoyed making me feel unwanted. If I had attended the wedding, Ryan's parents might have thanked me for the honeymoon. Ryan might have mentioned the sister fund. Someone might have asked whether I had approved the downtown apartment Mallory kept describing. One ordinary conversation could have collapsed months of planning. Ryan had built his wedding around a fund with my name on it. I had never opened that fund, funded it, or even heard of it. 2 days after I learned about the sister fund, I drove to Blue Heron Travel's office in Raleigh with my driver's license, passport, bank statement, and a printed copy of every email I had exchanged with Mallory about the honeymoon. The morning traffic gave me too much time to imagine what I might find. Part of me still wanted the agency to be responsible, because a careless employee would be easier to understand than my sister constructing an entire version of me and using it to spend my money. By the time I reached the small office near the shopping district, I had rehearsed the facts enough times that my voice sounded calm, even to me. Lila met me in the lobby and checked my identification before taking me into a conference room. A young employee named Evan sat at the end of the table, with his hands folded tightly over a yellow legal pad. He looked exhausted and defensive, and for the first few minutes, every answer came with an explanation attached. He had handled the original request. He had seen an active payment token from my parents' anniversary trip, received a signed authorization, and spoken with a woman who knew where my parents had stayed, how many nights they had booked, and which airline I had chosen for them. The woman said I was traveling for work and could not answer my usual number, so Evan called the local Google Voice number listed in the email instead. "Did you ever call the number already in my customer profile?" I asked. His eyes shifted toward Leela. "No. I thought the callback number on the new authorization had replaced it." Lila's expression tightened. It hadn't. I expected to feel satisfied when Evan admitted he had broken procedure, but I did not. His mistake had created the opening, yet it did not explain how someone knew the details needed to walk through it. I asked him to take me through the process in order, without defending any decision. The first email requested a quote. The second asked the agency to hold the villa. The caller then supplied my date of birth, old address, and information about my parents' anniversary booking. Evan had requested written authorization because of the cost, and the signed form arrived less than an hour later with a copy of my license attached. Lila explained that the villa had been held, but the trip was not fully purchased. The agency had requested authorization for a $3,500 deposit. Airline tickets had not been issued, and most of the resort balance had not settled. The pending bank authorization could still be stopped while the agency's insurer reviewed the case. Their system had preserved the call log and recording before anyone contacted Mallory. Evan had been careless, but nothing in the record showed that he knew her or received anything from her. I could see how badly he wanted me to accuse him, because an accusation would give him something simple to fight. Instead, I wrote down every step he described. The emails were printed and placed in front of me because the agency could release communications sent in my name after verifying my identity, while the insurer retained the original electronic records. The fake address looked almost right. One letter in my last name had been doubled, a difference easy to miss on a phone screen. The signature block used a work number I had abandoned 2 years earlier, but Mallory and my mother had both stored it in their contacts. The writer also called Mallory my baby sister, a phrase I had never used in my life. Diane used it constantly, especially when she wanted to remind me that Mallory was younger and therefore somehow less responsible for her choices. Several sentences sounded like my mother, but instinct was not evidence. Diane favored soft words that concealed hard demands. She wrote that I wanted the honeymoon to be a loving surprise, that I preferred to handle money privately, and that I hoped the agency would protect the joy of the moment by avoiding unnecessary calls. I could hear her voice in every phrase, but I could not prove she had written them. Mallory had spent her entire life listening to the same language. Either woman could have copied the other, and I was beginning to understand that their shared vocabulary was part of how they protected each other. I placed the new authorization beside the form from my parents' anniversary trip. The signatures did not merely resemble one another. The broken stroke near the final letter appeared in exactly the same place. A small dot of ink beneath my first initial was identical, as was the slight blur where the old document had been scanned. A real signature changed every time a person wrote it, even when the shape remained familiar. These two were copies of the same image. They didn't practice my signature, I said. They lifted it from this form. Lila leaned over the documents but did not make a conclusion she was not qualified to make. She said the insurer would send both original files to a document examiner. That distinction mattered. I could recognize what had happened, but recognition was not the same as proof that could survive a legal challenge. For the first time since the call with Mallory, I felt the size of the problem without feeling the need to solve every piece of it myself. The final email in the packet was dated 2 days before the wedding. Most of it discussed airport transfers and the private villa, but the last paragraph changed the direction of the entire investigation. The person writing as me said the honeymoon should be completed first because I would confirm the apartment guarantee after the trip details were settled. I read the sentence again, then asked Lila whether anyone at the agency had discussed an apartment with the caller. She shook her head. The agency handled travel, not housing, and the line had seemed like an unrelated personal note. It was not unrelated to me. In June, Mallory had asked me to guarantee a luxury apartment in downtown Raleigh. The rent was more than $3,000 a month, and the building required either a high income or a qualified guarantor. Mallory said Ryan's commissions would increase after the wedding, but his current pay records did not support the lease. I refused, because guaranteeing the apartment would make me responsible if they failed to pay. Diane called me afterward and said I was treating marriage like a business transaction. I told her a lease was a business transaction, no matter how many wedding photographs Mallory planned to hang on the walls. I checked my inbox at the agency and searched the apartment building's name, Mallory's name, and every variation of guarantor. Nothing appeared. That did not reassure me. If the fake email had been used for the application, the management company might believe it had already contacted me. The honeymoon was no longer an isolated theft. It looked like the first completed step in a larger attempt to establish that I routinely financed Mallory's marriage. My instinct was to find the fake email account, reset its password, and see what else had been sent. I understood systems well enough to imagine several ways of tracing it, but none of them gave me the right to enter an account I did not control. Lila warned me that the insurer needed the electronic evidence untouched. If I tried to access it myself, Mallory could later claim I had altered or created messages. I left the agency with copies of the documents I was entitled to receive and a written confirmation that the booking remained frozen. I sat in my car for nearly 10 minutes before calling the attorney a coworker had recommended. Admitting the situation aloud was harder than reading the forged form. I had handled million-dollar contracts without embarrassment, yet I struggled to say that my own sister might have copied my signature and used my identity. The attorney, Marisol Vega, did not react with shock or pity. She asked whether I had accessed the fake account, confronted Mallory about the documents, or deleted any messages. When I said no, she told me to keep it that way. Marisol instructed me to freeze my credit with all 3 bureaus, preserve the texts and emails I already possessed, and stop discussing evidence with my family. She would contact the apartment management company through a formal notice and help me file an identity theft report once we confirmed what had been submitted. She also warned me not to treat the agency's mistake as proof that everyone there was involved. "Your job is not to solve the whole case," she said. "Your job is to protect your name and avoid damaging the evidence." That sentence exposed a flaw I had always mistaken for strength. I believed competence meant carrying every problem until it was finished. Asking for help felt like surrendering control, and surrendering control reminded me too much of my family. But the people who had used my identity were counting on me to react emotionally, privately, and alone. The wiser decision was to bring in people whose authority did not depend on whether Diane called the situation a misunderstanding. Before I drove home, I looked once more at the last email. The writer had not ended with a thank you or a question about the resort. The final promise made in my name concerned an apartment I had already refused to guarantee. By Friday morning, my kitchen table had disappeared beneath paper. I had printed every email I sent Mallory, every message Ryan had shown me, the agency notes Lila was allowed to release, and the invitation Aunt Susan photographed. I arranged them in date order and wrote the numbers across the top of a legal pad. In January, I had offered a honeymoon gift capped at $8,000. In April, Mallory told Ryan there was a $50,000 sister fund. In early June, she sent me an itinerary for nearly $28,000, and I rejected it. 2 weeks later, I refused to guarantee their apartment. By July, someone was using my name to approve both. The timeline made one fact impossible to ignore. Mallory had promised Ryan my money before I had promised her any specific trip. I was good at making complicated problems sit still on paper. Contracts had dates, obligations, and signatures. Once every item occupied the correct line, people could not hide behind tone or memory. My family was different. Diane could turn a clear refusal into evidence that I needed more time. Mallory could turn a limited gift into a permanent commitment. Looking at the timeline, I had to remind myself that proving what happened would not automatically make Ryan ready to believe it. A spreadsheet could expose a lie, but it could not tell a newly married man what to do with the woman who had told it. Before I met him, I wrote down the 3 times I had given Mallory meaningful financial help. During her second year of college, I paid for a semester of textbooks after her grant arrived late. When she was 25, I covered part of a transmission repair so she could keep her job. 2 Christmases earlier, I bought her a flight home after a storm canceled the cheaper ticket she had booked. None of those choices had ruined me, and none had been made under threat. Mallory had thanked me each time and, at least in the beginning, repaid what she could. The damage came later, when Diane began retelling those moments as proof that I had always taken care of my baby sister. A favor with a beginning and an end became a family tradition I was no longer allowed to stop. Ryan chose a coffee shop in Cary, halfway between my apartment and the townhouse where he and Mallory were staying after the wedding. He was already seated when I arrived, wearing the same expression I had heard in his voice on the phone, tired, angry, and determined not to look afraid. He did not apologize for accusing me of jealousy, and I did not expect him to. I set my folder on the table but kept it closed. "I was too cold with you the other day," I said. "You asked a question, and I answered like I was reviewing a contract. I'm sorry for the way I said it. I'm not sorry that the money was never approved." His shoulders loosened slightly, though his jaw remained tight. "Mallory said you would deny it once you got upset." I held his gaze and reminded myself that correcting my tone did not require surrendering the truth. "That is why we need dates," I said, opening the folder between us. "Not predictions about my personality." We placed our phones between us. Ryan opened messages from the months before the wedding while I showed him my original offer and the email rejecting the luxury itinerary. Mallory had told him the sister fund was $50,000, enough to cover the remaining venue balance, the honeymoon, and the deposit on their downtown apartment. She described it as money I had set aside because I had no children and wanted to help her begin married life without debt. I showed Ryan the only actual offer I had made, with the $8,000 ceiling stated twice. Then I showed him my refusal to guarantee the lease. He read both messages without speaking, his thumb resting motionless against the edge of my phone. "What did she say when you turned down the apartment?" he asked. I told him Mallory had accused me of treating her marriage like a business transaction. Ryan looked away toward the window before admitting that Diane had later told him I had changed my mind. "According to my mother, I wanted the legal responsibility handled quietly because I hated discussing money." "Did either of you ever receive that from me?" I asked. His answer came quickly. "No, but your name was on everything she showed me." I asked why he had never thanked me, confirmed the amount, or even called to discuss the apartment. The question embarrassed him more than the documents had. He admitted that $50,000 seemed excessive, especially after the wedding budget had already climbed past what they could comfortably pay. He had considered asking me directly, but the answer might have required him and Mallory to cancel things they wanted. It had been easier to accept her explanation that I preferred privacy. He had signed contracts based on a fund he had never verified because he liked the future it made possible. "I was lied to," he said. I told him that was true, but it was not the whole truth. He had also chosen not to look too closely. Ryan flinched, but I did not soften the sentence. He had been manipulated, yet treating him as completely innocent would only replace one false story with another. He still resisted calling the documents fraud. He suggested Diane might have believed I would change my mind, and Mallory might have completed forms because she thought our mother already had permission. I told him belief did not create authorization, but I did not ask him to choose between his wife and the evidence at that table. He needed to reach his own conclusion, or he would spend the next year blaming me for placing it in his hands. Ryan scrolled farther back through his messages. A week before the wedding, Mallory had written, "Do not bring up money with Claire at the wedding. She hates making gifts about herself." Ryan had responded that he wanted to thank me in person. Mallory told him I would be in Toronto anyway, and that mentioning the fund later would embarrass me. He stared at the exchange for a long time. The same woman who told me the ceremony was family only had told her husband I chose work over the wedding. She had also instructed him to avoid the one conversation that could have exposed the lie. "She planned around you two never speaking," he said. Before I could answer, my phone rang from a number marked as a verification service. The caller identified herself as an analyst with the third-party company screening guarantors for the apartment building. She said an application used my name, but the email provided by the applicant did not match independently verified data, and the required identity check had not been completed. She did not discuss details until I answered security questions using information that had not come from the application. Then she sent a secure link to the email address she had verified through the screening process. Ryan watched as I opened it. The file preview thanked me for agreeing to guarantee the lease and listed the monthly rent at just over $3,000. Beneath the application sat the same scan of my driver's license, with the triangular crease in the corner, and the same copied signature from my parents' anniversary authorization. The application had not been approved. It still required a live identity check and direct confirmation from me. But someone had already filled in my income. Employer. address, and supposed relationship to the applicants. They had not asked whether I wanted to help Mallory and Ryan build their life. The form thanked me for already agreeing. The apartment manager joined the call less than an hour after the verification file reached me. Ryan sat across from me at the coffee shop while I put my phone on speaker and identified myself through the building's screening vendor. I stated clearly that I had never submitted the guarantor application, never signed it, and never authorized anyone to use my identification. The manager did not delete the file. She placed the entire application on hold, preserved the uploaded documents, and marked the guarantor section as disputed. She explained that the lease could not proceed without a completed identity check and direct confirmation from me. Ryan asked what would happen to the money he and Mallory had already paid. The manager said their application fee was non-refundable, and the holding deposit might also be lost because the information submitted with the application was materially inaccurate. Ryan looked at me as though there might still be a sentence I could say that would make the building return the money. I understood the question he did not ask. I could have offered to replace the deposit and made the immediate problem disappear. That was exactly the kind of choice my family expected me to make. I closed my folder and told him I was sorry he was dealing with the consequences, but I would not pay for an application built around my stolen identity. Ryan did not argue. He looked down at Mallory's messages and said he needed to speak to his wife. I told him he should, but I would not meet with her alone to negotiate money or documents. He gave me a tired nod before leaving the coffee shop. I watched him walk toward his car and felt no sense of victory. He had ignored warning signs because believing Mallory was easier than asking difficult questions. Now, those questions belonged to him. I had spent too many years taking responsibility for other people's uncomfortable conversations. That afternoon, Marisol walked me through the next steps. I froze my credit with all 3 bureaus and placed a fraud alert on my file. She reminded me that neither action erased the travel authorization or the apartment application. The freeze was a locked door against new accounts. The report was a trail showing when I first learned someone had used my information and what I did to stop it. Neither guaranteed an arrest, a prosecution, or even a quick investigation. The identity theft report asked me to identify anyone I suspected. I stared at Mallory's name for nearly a minute before typing it. Writing the name felt more severe than saying it aloud. She was my sister, but the form did not ask whether I loved her, whether our mother would forgive me, or whether Mallory had cried after the wedding. It asked whose actions I had reason to suspect. Leaving the space blank would not protect Mallory. It would only weaken my ability to correct records created in my name. I signed the report and submitted it. Mallory arrived at my home the next evening without calling. When I opened the door, she stood in the hallway wearing oversized sunglasses and the diamond ring Ryan had given her. She carried no purse, coat, or overnight bag. She had come prepared to be seen as a newlywed whose sister had ruined the first week of her marriage. I stepped into the hall and closed my door behind me. I did not want her walking through my rooms, touching my belongings, or later claiming that something had happened without witnesses nearby. "You filed a report against me," she said. "I filed a report about documents submitted in my name." Her mouth tightened. "You know what that means." "Yes, it means there is now an official record that I did not authorize the transactions." Mallory pulled off her sunglasses. Her eyes were red, though I could not tell how much came from crying and how much came from lack of sleep. She said Ryan was staying at a hotel and would barely answer her calls. The apartment was gone, the resort had released the villa, and her new husband was treating her like a criminal. She described every consequence as something done to her by other people. Not once did she mention the copied signature or the false email. "You promised me a life-changing wedding gift," she said. "You knew what this meant to me. I promised airfare and 5 nights within an $8,000 limit. I never promised a $50,000 fund. I rejected the itinerary you sent. I refused to guarantee the apartment." She folded her arms over her chest. "Mom said you would come around. Mom cannot authorize my money. You are going to give me the trip anyway." The sentence was not an apology, but it was the closest Mallory had come to acknowledging what she had done. In her mind, my original offer erased the need for consent. The amount could change, the documents could change, and my answer could change, but the existence of the gift meant she owned whatever she had imagined around it. A gift is not permission to become me, I said. Who copied my signature? Mallory looked toward the stairwell instead of answering. She said Lila had needed a signature on file, and everyone understood that I intended to pay. I asked why the apartment application used the same signature. She said the building wanted unnecessary paperwork, and she believed our mother had already explained the arrangement to me. Every answer moved responsibility in a circle. The agency required it. The apartment required it. Diane approved it. I had intended it. Mallory was always at the center of the action, and somehow never responsible for making a choice. When I told her the copied license came from the blue emergency file, her face changed for less than a second. It was enough. She knew which copy I meant. She recovered quickly and accused me of trying to turn our mother against her. I asked again who had scanned the documents and created the false email. She began crying, then said Ryan might leave her before they had been married a full week. That will be a consequence of lying to your husband, I said. The words were true, but the moment they left my mouth, I knew I had chosen precision over humanity. I did not regret holding the boundary. I regretted speaking as though the collapse of her marriage were only another line on my timeline. Mallory had hurt me deliberately, but my coldness was still mine to own. She wiped her face, put her sunglasses back on, and said she hoped I enjoyed being right before walking toward the elevator. That evening, a family group message appeared on my phone. Mallory wrote that she had gone to my home to beg for help and that I had told her the end of her marriage was simply a consequence she deserved. She did not mention the forged signature, the apartment application, or my repeated questions about the false email. My sentence stood alone, stripped of everything that had led to it. Within an hour, Aunt Susan asked whether Mallory had truly come to apologize. A cousin I rarely spoke to wrote that involving police in a family misunderstanding was extreme. Diane sent me a private message saying cruelty was not the same as strength. I could have responded with every document. Instead, Marisol helped me write a short email addressed only to my parents, Mallory and Ryan. I stated that my name, identification, credit, and signature could not be used without written authorization. I instructed them to direct all financial communication through my attorney. I did not describe my feelings or defend my absence from the wedding. The email was clean, factual, and impossible to misunderstand. It was also emotionally empty, and Diane knew exactly how to use that. She forwarded parts of it to relatives and said I had replaced my family with a lawyer. Calls arrived from people who knew almost nothing about the documents, but had strong opinions about forgiveness. One uncle told me Mallory had made a mistake during a stressful time. I asked whether he would sign a $28,000 authorization in her name to prove mistakes did not matter. He ended the call soon afterward. By the following morning, I understood something my professional life had never taught me. Facts did not travel through a family at the same speed as emotion. Mallory could say she was crying, and everyone immediately knew which role to play. I could produce a time-stamped authorization, and people still wanted to discuss my tone. My mistake had been believing the truth would defend itself while I remained silent behind perfect sentences. Diane called late that afternoon. Her voice was soft and exhausted, the voice she used when she wanted the other person to feel guilty for making her work so hard. She said the family needed to sit together before lawyers made everything irreversible. According to her, the agency and apartment building could be told the situation was a misunderstanding if I signed one simple paper. Robert came onto the line and asked me to come to the house because Mallory was falling apart and Ryan had not returned home. I told them I would consider it, then called Marisol. She warned me not to sign anything, surrender original documents, or agree that I had ever authorized the transactions. If Diane produced paperwork, I was to photograph every page and leave with nothing unresolved. I agreed to the dinner, not because I believed a meal could repair fraud, but because my mother still thought she could control the meaning of what had happened. My mother said one signature could make the entire problem disappear. By then, I knew better than to ask whose signature she meant. The house in Cary looked exactly as it had the last time I left it angry. The porch light still leaned slightly to the left, the brass knocker still needed polishing, and my mother had placed 2 pots of white flowers beside the door, as if neat arrangements could control what happened inside. Diane opened the door before I knocked. She hugged me with both arms, and held on long enough to make the embrace feel like evidence that we were still a loving family. The smell of rosemary chicken drifted from the kitchen. It had been my favorite dinner when I was growing up, which meant my mother had prepared the evening as carefully as she prepared every argument. Mallory and Ryan were already seated at the dining table. Mallory wore a pale sweater despite the July heat, her face bare and tired. Ryan sat beside her, but had left enough space between their chairs for another person. Robert poured water into glasses without looking at anyone. Diane touched my shoulder and said she was glad I had finally agreed to come home. I almost corrected her. I had agreed to attend one conversation, not return to the role she had assigned me. Instead, I placed my phone and the slim folder Marisol told me to carry beside my plate. The office door stood open across the hallway. From my chair, I could see the small safe built into the lower cabinet. Its door was ajar, but the blue emergency folder was not visible on the shelf where Diane had kept it for years. I did not ask about it yet. My mother wanted me reacting to the dinner, the silence, and Mallory's swollen eyes. I wanted to know what she had placed in front of me before I showed her what I had noticed. Diane began the meal by talking about childhood. She reminded us that Mallory had followed me from room to room, copied my clothes, and cried when I left for college. She said my sister had always needed me more than I understood. The copied signature, fake email, and apartment application never entered her version of events. She spoke about closeness, pressure, and how frightening marriage could be for a younger sister. Then she said the whole family had sacrificed so I could become successful. What did Mallory sacrifice for my career? I asked. Diane blinked. That is not what I meant. What did you and Dad sacrifice that gives Mallory permission to sign my name? Robert stopped moving his fork. Mallory stared at her plate. Diane's smile tightened, as if I had broken a rule by asking for a specific answer. She said the issue was not who signed which piece of paper. The issue was that Mallory and Ryan had planned a wedding and a new home based on a promise they believed I had made. By freezing the travel payment and challenging the apartment application, I had embarrassed them in front of 2 families and several businesses. Who sent the authorization? I asked. Diane exhaled slowly. Claire, if you reduce every family crisis to one technical question, no one will ever be able to reach you. It is not technical when the signature is mine. She looked toward Robert, as though she expected him to redirect me. He lowered his eyes. For once, he did not tell me to give my mother a chance to explain. After dinner, Diane cleared the plates and returned with a cream folder. She placed it in front of me with a pen balanced across the top. This is all Marisol needs to send to the agency and the apartment company, she said. It confirms there was an understanding between sisters, and that the paperwork became confused. The document was 2 pages long. The first page said I had intended to provide a honeymoon gift, that communication between family members had failed, and that no person had acted with deliberate intent to harm me. It did not say I had approved the $28,000 itinerary. It did not mention the copied signature. Its language was soft enough to sound harmless, while leaving enough room for Mallory to claim I had agreed to everything. I turned to the second page. Diane immediately told me the rest was standard language. That made me read more slowly. Near the bottom, one paragraph stated that I released Mallory, Diane, Robert, and all related parties from claims arising from any family financial arrangement, communication, document, representation, or transaction occurring before the date of my signature. The waiver was not limited to the honeymoon. It could be used against the apartment dispute, the identity theft report, and any other transaction I had not yet discovered. I read the paragraph aloud. Diane's face hardened. Only, you could read an apology like a business contract. It is a contract. It is a family agreement. It waives legal claims. It lets everyone move forward. No, it lets the people who used my identity decide that I am not allowed to ask what else they did. Mallory pushed back from the table. She said no one had stolen my identity. Lila had required a signature on file, and Mallory had used one because I had already agreed to give her the trip in spirit. She described the form as a shortcut, not a forgery. When I asked why the same copied signature appeared on the apartment application, she looked at Diane. Mom said everything was already cleared, Mallory said. Diane turned sharply toward her. I said Claire would understand once she stopped being emotional. You told me the documents were fine. I told you she had helped before. I did not tell you to submit anything without confirming it. Ryan leaned forward. Then why did you tell me Claire changed her mind about the apartment? Diane held up one hand. This is exactly what Claire wanted. She brought lawyers into the family, and now everyone is trying to protect themselves. I had not asked Mallory to blame our mother. I had not asked Ryan to challenge his wife. Diane was watching control slip away and treating the loss as proof that I had attacked her. She reached for the waiver and pushed it closer to me. Sign it, Claire. We can sort out who misunderstood what after the businesses stopped treating Mallory like a criminal. I capped the pen and placed it beside the folder. You want me to remove the consequences before anyone tells me the truth. Mallory began to cry. She said Ryan had moved into a hotel, his parents would not answer her calls, and the wedding bills were arriving. She asked whether I wanted to destroy her entire life over paperwork. I told her the paperwork was how she had tried to attach her life to mine without permission. Her tears did not change the amount, the signature, or the false address. Robert finally spoke. His voice was quiet enough that we all stopped. I sent Diane the old anniversary authorization. My mother turned toward him. Robert, that has nothing to do with this. He said Diane had asked for the booking number and hotel details from their anniversary trip at the end of June. The original confirmation email contained several attachments, including the authorization I signed 3 years earlier. Robert had forwarded the entire email without opening the files. He assumed Diane was helping Mallory compare resort options. Why did you send financial documents with my signature on them without asking me? I asked. He rubbed one hand across his forehead. Your mother said she was handling it. That has been your answer my entire life. He nodded once, and the movement carried more shame than any defense could have. Robert said he always believed asking fewer questions kept the peace. Diane handled the details, Mallory stopped crying, and eventually I solved whatever remained. He had mistaken silence for neutrality, even when his silence gave other people what they needed to hurt me. Diane stood and said the conversation was over. She accused Robert of betraying her to earn my forgiveness. I told her he had not earned forgiveness. He had only stopped making the situation worse for the first time. Then I photographed both pages of the waiver, returned them to the folder, and picked up my phone. Robert followed me into the hallway before I reached the front door. He asked me to wait, then led me into the office. Diane called his name from the dining room, but he closed the door behind us. He opened the safe and pulled out the blue family emergency folder from behind a stack of insurance binders. The copy of my driver's license was gone. So was the old travel authorization. He woke the printer screen and opened the recent scan history. 2 file names appeared under the date he remembered forwarding the anniversary email. One read Claire ID clean, the other read old travel authorization. The history did not prove who had attached the files to an email or altered the form, but it proved someone in that house had prepared the exact documents later used in my name. Robert stared at the screen and said Diane had spent nearly an hour in the office that night. Before she went to bed, he saw her send an email to Mallory. He had not read it, and the message was no longer in the shared computers sent folder. He could not tell me what my mother had written. He could only tell me she had sent it the same night she scanned my identification. The morning after the dinner, Marisol sent preservation notices to Blue Heron Travel, the apartment management company, and the screening vendor that had processed the guarantor application. She explained that the notices did not accuse anyone of a crime or force them to turn over every record immediately. They instructed each organization to preserve emails, uploaded documents, call logs, recordings, account notes, and system timestamps while the disputes were investigated. A year earlier, I would have called every office myself and tried to supervise every step. This time, I let Marisol handle the legal requests, Lila work with the agency's insurer, and the apartment company conduct its own review. Giving up control did not feel natural, but it kept me from damaging the evidence in my attempt to understand it. The agency's insurer took several weeks to complete its first review. During that time, Mallory left voicemails, asking me to withdraw the report. Diane sent messages about forgiveness, and Robert offered to give Marisol access to the shared computer at the house. I answered none of them directly. Every communication went into a dated folder. The pending deposit disappeared from my bank account before it settled, and the villa was released. That protected my money, but it did not make the impersonation vanish. Someone had still called an agency, used private information, and asked an employee to charge an old payment token in my name. In August, Marisol and I joined Lila and an insurance investigator in a conference room at the agency. A notice at the beginning of the recording stated that calls could be monitored for quality assurance. Then a woman gave my name and date of birth in a voice I had known since she learned to speak. Mallory sounded calm and prepared. She knew the destination and dates of my parents' anniversary trip, the resort they had used, and the final 4 digits associated with the stored payment token. When Evan offered to call the number already attached to my customer profile, she told him to use only the number she was calling from because she was traveling and did not want Mallory contacted until the gift was confirmed. Hearing my sister pretend to be me was different from reading the form. On paper, the fraud had seemed almost mechanical. On the recording, she borrowed my hesitation before answering a security question and the professional tone I used when speaking to vendors. She had listened closely enough to imitate the version of me strangers trusted. Lila recognized her voice, and I did too, but the investigator warned us that recognition by family members was only a lead. Then Ryan produced the vendor contact sheet from the wedding. The Google Voice number, used in the agency call, appeared beside Mallory's name on contracts with the florist, photographer, and venue. The agency had not connected that number to the honeymoon traveler profile because Evan treated the caller as the purchaser rather than one of the passengers. His failure to verify the established number was a serious procedural mistake, but there was no evidence he knew Mallory or helped her intentionally. The insurer had also hired a document examiner to compare the electronic authorization with the form from my parents' anniversary trip. The examiner did not describe the result in dramatic language. She simply showed us that the new signature was not a fresh attempt to copy my handwriting. It was the same digital image taken from the old file, resized and placed over the signature line. The broken final stroke, the ink dot beneath my first initial, and the scanning noise around the edges matched the source image. The discovery cleared one question that had followed me since my first meeting with Lila. No employee had watched someone sign the form. Mallory had submitted a document designed to make a copied signature look newly executed. Ryan called me later that week. He had spent the previous month searching old messages, wedding files, and attachments Mallory had sent him while they planned the ceremony. He found an email she had forwarded in June to prove that the honeymoon arrangements had been approved by my family. It was not a screenshot or copied block of text. Mallory had forwarded Diane's original message as an attached email file. Marisol told Ryan not to resend or open it on multiple devices. He delivered the laptop to his attorney, who preserved the original and created a forensic copy. The file retained Diane's address, timestamp, routing information, and 2 attachments. One was labeled Claire ID Clean. The other was labeled Old Travel Authorization. Diane's message read, "Here are the copies you asked for. Claire will complain about the price, but she won't let the bill go unpaid once the plans are final." My mother had not written that she believed I had approved the trip. She had written that my refusal would stop mattering once enough money had been committed. Her attorney later confirmed through the pre-suit exchange that the message had come from her account. The scan history Robert showed me had established when the files were created. The email established where they went. Ryan admitted that Mallory had shown him the message before the wedding. He saw my name on the attachments but never opened them. Diane's confidence had reassured him, and he wanted to believe the apartment, honeymoon, and remaining wedding expenses had a source other than debt. He had been deceived, but he had also ignored every opportunity to verify the story. I thanked him for preserving the file, without telling him that providing evidence erased his choices. It did not. He would still be responsible for the contracts he signed and the questions he decided not to ask. The hardest evidence arrived in the text export Ryan provided through his attorney. The messages did not contain a confession written for my benefit. They contained ordinary planning conversations between two people who believed I would never read them. After the agency requested authorization, Ryan asked what would happen if I refused the final amount. Mallory answered, "Once the charge is clear, Claire won't let us default." In another exchange, Ryan questioned whether asking me to guarantee the apartment was too much after the honeymoon. Mallory wrote, "Claire doesn't have children. What else is she going to spend it on?" I sat alone in Marisol's office after reading that sentence. The money itself no longer felt like the deepest violation. Mallory had looked at the absence of children in my life and converted it into unused capacity. In her private logic, anything I had not spent on a husband or a child was waiting for her to claim. My savings were not the result of years of work, discipline, and choices. They were an empty space in my life that she believed she deserved to fill. Diane had encouraged that belief by teaching both of us that Mallory's need carried more moral weight than my consent. Marisol was preparing a settlement demand when Aunt Susan sent me a screenshot of a post Mallory had shared online. She did not use my name. She wrote that a wealthy relative had promised to fund her wedding gift, withdrew it out of jealousy, and was now using lawyers to force her to admit to a felony. Diane began calling relatives with the same version. According to her, I was threatening to destroy Mallory unless she signed a confession written by my attorney. The forged documents became a misunderstanding. The copied signature became an old family form. The false apartment application became something Mallory believed I would approve later. By the time I had the recording, the authenticated email, the document examiner's conclusion, and Mallory's own texts, she had already told everyone what those things were supposed to mean. I had spent weeks protecting evidence because I believed proof would settle the argument. Mallory understood something I was only beginning to learn. In a family like ours, the first story people heard could matter almost as much as the truth. The calls began before breakfast and continued for 3 days. Some relatives accused me of humiliating a newlywed over money. Others asked careful questions because Mallory's version did not explain why an apartment company and a travel insurer were involved. Most of them knew only that I had offered a gift, withdrawn it after missing the wedding, and hired a lawyer when my sister became upset. Diane had reduced months of planning, forged documents, and false promises to a single image everyone understood. One successful daughter punishing the younger one for having a beautiful wedding. Aunt Susan was the first person who asked what had actually happened, without telling me how I should feel about it. I nearly answered the way I always did, with dates, amounts, and the difference between an offer and an authorization. Then I remembered how quickly Ryan had heard contempt in my voice when I treated his marriage like a file under review. The documents were false, I told her, but that isn't the only reason I'm angry. They invited more than 100 people and told me it was family only. Mom told everyone I chose work over Mallory. They erased me from the wedding and then used my name to pay for what came after it. Saying those words hurt more than describing the copied signature, but Susan finally understood that the fraud had not begun with money. It had begun with the belief that my presence was unnecessary as long as my resources remained available. Susan apologized for believing the Toronto story and asked whether she should confront Diane publicly. I told her no. I did not need another relative speaking for me, even if she meant well. For most of my life, my family had fought about what Claire supposedly wanted without asking Claire. I was not going to replace Diane's version with Susan's and call that progress. I thanked her for listening and said I would share the facts with the people who had been directly used in the lie. Marisol helped me prepare a 2-page timeline. It contained no photograph of my license, no bank information, and no recording that could spread online. It listed the $8,000 limit I had offered, the date I rejected the itinerary worth nearly $28,000, the fraud hold placed by the agency, and the apartment company's confirmation that I had never completed its identity check. We sent it only to Ryan, his parents, Robert, Lila, and the apartment management company. At the bottom, I wrote one sentence in plain language. I was not asking anyone to choose between me and Mallory. I was asking them not to repeat that I had approved transactions I had refused in writing. Ryan's parents called him the same evening. They had increased their contribution to the wedding after Mallory told them my sister fund would cover the honeymoon and help the couple move into their apartment. They had not asked me, because Mallory said I disliked public gratitude and wanted the gift kept private. Once they saw the timeline, they stopped treating the missing money as a conflict between sisters. They asked Ryan to separate the joint checking account, review every debt opened during the engagement, and determine what he had signed without independent verification. Ryan moved from the hotel into a furnished apartment near his office. He did not file for divorce immediately. He told me that leaving after less than a week of marriage felt like admitting his entire relationship had been built on something he had chosen not to examine. I reminded him that Mallory had lied to him, but I did not tell him he had been powerless. He had accepted a $50,000 promise from a woman he barely spoke to because the promise allowed him to keep the wedding, the apartment, and the image of financial stability. I should have called you, he said. Yes, I answered. This time I did not sharpen the word into a weapon or soften it into comfort. It was simply true. Marisol sent a settlement demand to separate attorneys representing Mallory and Diane. The terms were narrower than either of them expected. Mallory had to acknowledge that the signature was not mine, repay the agency's documented losses and the costs created by the false apartment application, stop using my personal information, and stop telling anyone that I had approved the larger trip or the guarantee. Diane had to acknowledge that she supplied the identification and old authorization and agree to the same restrictions. All future financial communication had to go through counsel. I did not ask for a public apology, a social media confession, or money for emotional distress. Mallory's attorney responded that she would consider repayment only if the agreement described the incident as a family misunderstanding. Diane's attorney wanted her name removed entirely and argued that sending old family records did not prove she knew how Mallory would use them. Neither response addressed the sentence in Diane's email saying I would complain but would not let the bill go unpaid once the plans were final. They were still trying to preserve the same story, only now they wanted lawyers to write it in cleaner language. While the attorneys exchanged proposals, Blue Heron Travel's insurer made its own decision. The agency had suffered losses from employee time, the held resort inventory, the investigation, and the misuse of its payment system. Under its internal policy, the insurer prepared a fraud package and sent it to the investigator already assigned to the identity theft report I had filed. The apartment management company separately denied Mallory and Ryan's application and preserved the false guarantor documents. After receiving a valid legal request, it provided copies to the same investigator. Neither company was acting because I demanded revenge. They were protecting their records and responding to a scheme that had used their systems. When Marisol explained that to me, I felt an unexpected wave of fear. I had wanted the documents corrected, my credit protected, and the lies stopped. I had not spent my nights imagining Mallory being charged or Diane standing before a judge. For a moment, I wondered whether I should ask everyone to stop if Mallory repaid the money. Marisol reminded me that I could decide whether to accept a civil settlement, but I could not order independent companies to pretend they had not received false documents. I had reported the truth. What investigators did with verified records was no longer a private favor I could grant or withdraw. Ryan sent the full text export before mediation preparations began. I had already read Mallory's sentence asking what else I would spend my money on because I had no children. The next message had been partially hidden in the earlier screenshot. Diane replied, "Then this is one of the ways her success can still serve the family." I read the exchange until the words lost their shape. My mother had not viewed my career as a life I had built. She viewed it as a family asset. My savings, my time, and even the empty spaces where she thought a husband and children should have been were available for reassignment. That message ended the last argument I had been having with myself. Repayment could correct a financial loss, but it could not correct a system that still believed my consent was optional. I told Marisol I would not withdraw the report or sign any agreement that called deliberate impersonation a misunderstanding. Mallory and Diane could accept responsibility in language that reflected what they had done, or the civil and criminal processes could continue without my protection. Diane called that night and left a voicemail saying a good sister could still stop the family from being destroyed. I listened once, saved it with the others, and did not return the call. For the first time, my mother could not ask me to make the problem disappear. The problem no longer belonged only to me. By the time we entered mediation the following February, more than 6 months had passed since Mallory's wedding. My legal bills had crossed $8,000. My inbox contained hundreds of messages filed by date and sender, and Ryan had been living apart from Mallory since the end of July. Time had not made the situation feel smaller. It had only removed the excuses that depended on panic, wedding stress, or one bad decision made during an emotional week. Every month that passed gave Mallory and Diane another opportunity to tell the truth, and every month they chose a version that protected them instead. The mediation took place in a private office in Raleigh. It was an attempt to resolve the civil claims before anyone filed a lawsuit, not a courtroom proceeding and not a criminal hearing. I arrived with Marisol and a single binder. Mallory came with her own attorney. Diane entered 10 minutes later with a different lawyer because their interests no longer pointed in the same direction. Mallory faced evidence that she had impersonated me and submitted false documents. Diane wanted to limit her financial responsibility and insist that sending my records did not make her part of what followed. They sat on the same side of the room, but their chairs were far enough apart to make the distance between them visible. Robert was not there. He was not a party to the dispute, and I did not need him sitting beside me to prove that I had family support. His written statement, the scan history from the home computer, and the original email file he helped preserve were included with the documents both sides had agreed to review. For most of my life, my father had waited until a conflict became unbearable before admitting what he had seen. One useful statement did not erase that pattern, and I was no longer willing to turn a late act of honesty into complete redemption. The mediator asked whether we wanted to begin with opening statements. Marisol said a chronological review would be more useful than speeches. She placed my January email on the table first, the one promising airfare, and 5 hotel nights up to $8,000 after I approved the final itinerary. Mallory's attorney said no one disputed that I had intended to provide a honeymoon. Marisol placed the June rejection beside it, where I had refused the package worth almost $28,000, and repeated the limit in writing. The phrase, family misunderstanding, became harder to use once the original promise and the refusal sat next to each other. Next came the authorization submitted to Blue Heron Travel. It contained the copied signature and the false statement that I had delivered my documents at the rehearsal dinner. Mallory's attorney suggested she might have believed an old signature could be reused because the agency already had my payment token. Marisol responded with the call recording. Mallory's voice gave my name, my date of birth, and instructions not to contact the number on my established customer profile. She had not merely uploaded the wrong form. She had answered as me and built a reason the agency should not speak to the real Claire. The apartment application followed. It used the same false email, the same license scan, and the same copied signature. It also listed my employer, income, and relationship to the applicants. That second transaction destroyed the argument that the travel form had been a desperate shortcut for a gift I had generally approved. I had rejected the apartment guarantee before anyone submitted it. There was no promised gift to misunderstand. only a financial obligation someone had attempted to attach to my name. Marisol then opened the original email Diane had sent Mallory. The attachments were the cleaned scan of my license and the old travel authorization. The message said I would complain about the price, but would not let the bill go unpaid once the plans were final. Diane's lawyer said, "My mother believed she was helping Mallory prepare information for a gift I would eventually approve." Marisol pointed to the word complain. Diane had anticipated my objection before the documents were used. She had not believed my consent already existed. She had believed my resistance could be defeated by creating consequences I would feel responsible for fixing. The last items were Mallory's messages to Ryan. Once the charges cleared, she said, I would not let them default. In another exchange, she asked what else I would spend my money on because I did not have children. The room remained quiet after Marisol read that sentence. It was not proof of every action in the case, but it explained the belief beneath all of them. Mallory did not see my refusal as a final answer because she did not see my life as fully mine. The mediator asked Mallory whether she wanted to respond. She looked at me instead of at the documents. "Do you want your own sister to go to jail?" she asked. It was the wrong question, but it was the question she had been asking from the beginning. She wanted the discussion to begin with the severity of the consequences instead of the choices that created them. If I said no, she would ask me to undo whatever I could. If I said yes, she could make my anger the center of the story. "I don't want the court to destroy you," I said, "but I won't ask it to save you." Mallory's eyes filled with tears. She said I could end the criminal investigation by confirming that she had implied permission to use the signature. Her attorney immediately clarified that no one was asking me to make a false statement, but Mallory continued. She said I had always helped her. I had offered a honeymoon, and our mother had assured her I would accept the final amount once everything was booked. I told her history was not implied permission. A previous gift did not authorize a new transaction, and being her sister did not give her the right to speak as me. Diane leaned forward and said she had only sent documents because she believed I would eventually agree. Her lawyer described her involvement as poor judgment rather than intentional fraud. Marisol placed the waiver from our family dinner beside Diane's email. The document had attempted to release everyone from claims involving any prior family transaction, not merely the honeymoon. Diane had prepared it after she knew I disputed both applications. It did not prove she created the false email or made the agency call, but it showed that her first response to the discovery was not to ask what Mallory had done. It was to ask me to surrender my right to challenge it. My mother stopped speaking through her attorney and addressed me directly. She said our parents had sacrificed to help me build a successful career. She said Mallory was younger, marriage was expensive, and I had no children depending on my income. The words were quieter than the text Mallory had sent Ryan, but the meaning was the same. My success belonged to the family whenever someone else wanted access to it. My career is not a joint family asset, I said. My savings are not an inheritance you receive while I'm alive. You did not have to understand my choices, but you had to respect my answer. I did not give a longer speech. The evidence had already said everything else. Our final settlement offer was reasonable. Mallory would repay the documented losses caused by the false travel booking and apartment application, acknowledge in writing that the signature was not mine, stop using my personal information, and communicate with me only through counsel on financial matters. Diane would contribute to restitution because she had supplied the documents and would agree not to store or distribute copies of my identification again. Neither woman had to post an apology online, admit to crimes not established in court, or submit to public humiliation. Mallory refused the written acknowledgement. Her attorney said it could affect the criminal investigation. Diane refused any agreement that named her as responsible for providing the documents. They were willing to pay some money if the settlement described everything as a misunderstanding between sisters. They wanted the consequences reduced, without allowing the record to state what had happened. The mediator moved between rooms for another 2 hours, but the central issue did not change. I was willing to limit my demands. I was not willing to sign a lie. Mallory and Diane could have reduced the civil damage by admitting the signature was not mine and accepting restrictions that should never have been necessary. Instead, they protected the family image they had already lost. The mediation ended without an agreement. Outside the conference room, Marisol reminded me that the travel insurer's referral, the apartment records, and my identity theft report had been under investigation for months. The mediation could resolve private claims, but it could not force an investigator to discard authenticated evidence or prevent a prosecutor from reviewing it. Mallory and Diane had treated the police report like leverage I could withdraw once they pressured me hard enough. They had never accepted that other institutions had their own responsibilities. In March, I received formal notice that Mallory had been charged after interviews and document review were completed. The prosecutor had also examined Diane's role, but had not charged her at that stage. Her email proved she supplied the documents and expected me to object, but it did not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she knew Mallory would impersonate me on the phone, create the false address, and submit my copied signature. The civil case against her remained stronger because it did not require the same level of proof. I read the notice alone at my kitchen table. My name appeared beside the word victim, Mallory's appeared beside defendant. I did not feel triumphant, and I did not call anyone to celebrate. I felt only that the weight we had argued over for 8 months had finally been placed under the correct names. For 8 months, they had called it a family misunderstanding. The notice in my hand called it a case. At the end of July, more than a year after I filed the identity theft report, Marisol called to tell me Mallory had accepted a negotiated plea. The prosecutor had spent 4 months reviewing the agency recording, the false authorization, the apartment application, the document examiner's report, and the original email Diane sent with my identification attached. Mallory had no prior record, and no charge had ever settled against my bank account, so the prosecutor agreed to reduce some counts in exchange for a guilty plea involving impersonation and the submission of false documents. The agreement included a suspended sentence, supervised probation, community service, restitution, and an order prohibiting her from using, possessing, or attempting to access my financial information. I listened to Marisol explain the terms, without feeling the satisfaction I once imagined accountability might bring. Mallory would not be led away in handcuffs. She would return to her mother's house after court, report to a probation officer, complete her assigned hours, and make monthly payments from whatever income she could earn. The outcome was neither the destruction she had accused me of wanting, nor the harmless misunderstanding Diane had demanded. It was a formal record, stating that Mallory had done something wrong in my name. The prosecutor allowed me to submit a victim impact statement. I kept it short because I did not want the hearing to become the family argument Mallory had been trying to stage for a year. I wrote that the greatest harm was not the amount of money she attempted to spend. It was losing control over where my name appeared, what promises strangers believed I had made, and whether my refusal could be trusted. I did not request the maximum penalty, ask for jail, or describe every cruel thing Mallory had said. I asked only that the court preserve the restrictions protecting my identity and require restitution for the documented losses. Mallory looked toward me once during the hearing. Her expression was not angry in the way it had been outside my apartment. She looked smaller, as though she had finally reached a room where tears, family history, and our mother's explanations could not change the meaning of a signature. I did not smile at her or turn away dramatically. I sat beside Marisol, listened to the judge confirm that Mallory understood the agreement, and left when the hearing ended. Diane was never criminally charged. The prosecutor believed her email showed that she supplied my documents and expected me to object, but it did not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she knew Mallory would impersonate me on the phone, create a false email address, and submit the copied signature. The civil case required a different level of proof, and Diane's position weakened every time her attorney tried to explain why she had scanned my license, forwarded my authorization, and then prepared a waiver covering every prior family transaction. Her settlement required her to contribute to Blue Heron Travel's documented losses, reimburse part of my reasonable legal fees, and pay expenses connected to the false apartment application. She also agreed that she would not keep, copy, transfer, or use any of my identification or financial records. The remaining documents from the blue emergency folder were delivered to Marisol, and the digital copies on the family computer were deleted under the terms of the agreement. Diane paid her portion by cashing out a certificate of deposit and selling the second car she rarely used. She did not lose a mansion, a company, or an imaginary fortune. She lost money she had expected to keep because she had treated my identity as a family resource. Robert moved into a small apartment near Carrie before the settlement was signed. He told Diane he would consider counseling, but he would not return home merely because she described the separation as embarrassing. He did not ask me to explain his decision to her, carry messages between them, or confirm that he had finally become a good father. He called me directly every few weeks, usually to ask how I was doing and then listen to the answer. Our conversations remained careful and incomplete. One honest statement and one preserved computer did not erase decades of silence, but I no longer needed to decide all at once whether he deserved a permanent place in my life. Ryan and Mallory had signed a separation agreement during their first year apart. He remained responsible for his share of the venue debt and the contracts he had signed during the engagement. The canceled apartment did not remove the application fees, and the lost honeymoon did not refund every deposit connected to it. His parents helped him organize the debt but refused to erase it for him. Ryan had been lied to, yet he had also accepted promises he never verified, because they allowed him to live beyond what he and Mallory could afford. After they had lived separately for 1 year and 1 day, Ryan filed for absolute divorce in North Carolina. The divorce was not final when he called me, and he did not pretend the filing made him wise. He thanked me for refusing to hide the evidence when he was still trying to protect the marriage. I told him I hoped he had learned to ask questions before signing his name to someone else's promises. I did not offer to pay his debts, become his ally against Mallory, or tell him whether he should ever forgive her. Mallory moved back into her childhood bedroom, with boxes of wedding gifts stacked against one wall, and unopened bills covering the desk where she had once done her homework. I knew that only because Robert mentioned it while discussing the restitution schedule. I never went to see the room. Her life had already occupied too much space in mine. A week after the plea, Mallory emailed me from an address approved for settlement communication. She asked whether I truly wanted one mistake to follow her for the rest of her life. She wrote that every job application, apartment search, and serious relationship would now require explanations. The message still placed the record at my feet, as though I had created it by refusing to disappear beneath her version of events. I answered once. I did not create the record, Mallory. I stopped you from putting my name on it. After that, all communication returned to the attorneys. I sent one final email to the extended family. I did not attach the recording or ask anyone to condemn Mallory and Diane. I wrote that the legal matters had been resolved through documented processes, that no one needed to choose a side, and that I would not respond to requests to pay debts, rewrite the outcome, explain my boundaries repeatedly, or forgive according to someone else's deadline. Any future relationship with me would require honesty and respect for my decisions. Some relatives never answered. Others continued to say Mallory had suffered enough, though none offered to assume her restitution payments. Aunt Susan sent a simple apology for believing the Toronto story and said she understood if I needed distance. She did not ask when I would attend another family dinner. That made her apology easier to believe. By August, my legal expenses had reached a little over $10,000. I had paid them from my emergency fund, not from the $8,000 I had once reserved for Mallory's honeymoon. Diane's civil settlement reimbursed a reasonable portion, but not every hour, phone call, or sleepless night. I did not pretend I had made money by protecting myself. Boundaries had cost me something, but surrendering them would have cost more. Most of the original gift fund was still there. I used part of it to book a quiet trip for myself, nothing resembling the private villa Mallory had demanded. I chose a small hotel, one flight, and a week with no family obligations waiting at the destination. For the first time, I did not explain the expense to anyone or calculate whether spending money on myself would appear selfish. At Raleigh-Durham International Airport, the agent checked my identification and handed me a boarding pass. My name was spelled correctly, across the top. There was no sister fund, no guarantor line, no false email, and no promise attached to it that someone else had invented. The ticket carried only me, to a place I had chosen, with money I had decided to spend. My phone vibrated as I approached the gate. Diane's name appeared on the screen. I did not block her in anger, and I did not answer because guilt told me a ringing phone was an emergency. I turned on airplane mode, slipped the phone into my bag, and joined the boarding line. For years, I had confused being needed with being loved, but the gift I finally kept was not the honeymoon money. It was the right to own my life, without purchasing my place in someone else's family. You should never confuse being needed with being loved. Real family respects your no, protects your identity, and never spends your money, signs your name, or pressures you to hide wrongdoing. When someone crosses that line, document everything, protect your accounts, seek professional help, and let consequences fall where they belong. Setting boundaries may cost you relationships, but surrendering them can cost your safety, savings, and self-respect. You are not cruel for refusing to rescue people from choices they made. If this story reminded you to value consent and accountability, subscribe to the channel today for more powerful family stories.